So Rabosai, we're on Chav Ches Amud Beis here in Masechet Yoma, and we want to review just the kasha of Rav Yosef. So we put the new Gemara into perspective. Rav Yosef was bothered by a statement of Rav Safra, and we're dealing with the issue of the Zman Shchitas Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim. When is the earliest time to begin the process of Shchitas Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim? Rav Safra says that we're going to imitate Avram Avinu's Tfilas Mincha, Tzilusa de Avram, which is Michi Mishcharei or Mashcharei Kosle. So what we have is, we have a wall, and the wall on the eastern side begins to get dark, meaning the shadow, right? The sun is traveling from east to west, and when it begins to tip towards the west of this kosel, at that point, it casts a shade on the eastern side of the kosel. And that's the beginning of the seventh hour, meaning what we call 12 noon. And Rav Safra is going to derive from Tzelusa to Avram. If Avram daven Mincha at that time, then Mincha is Keneged Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim. It must mean that Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim is going to be brought at noon, at the beginning of the seventh hour. So Rav Yosef says, I don't understand. Anan me Avram Nekum v'Nigmar? Do we derive halachas from Avram Avinu? Avram Avinu maybe was a super duper zariz. His alacrity was incredible. Doesn't mean that we have to establish the zman for Tfilas Mincha and the zman for the shchita of the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim based on Avram Avinu. So Rava says, I don't understand. What kind of problem are you raising, Rav Yosef? Why shouldn't we derive from Avram Avinu? For example, you want to know when is the time to be Makayim the mitzvah of Milah, and we're going to learn it from Avram Avinu. Vayashkim Avram b'boker. And even though Kol Hayom Kosher l'Milah, but nevertheless, we're going to follow Avram's footsteps. We're going to imitate Avram, and it says by Avram Vayashkem Avram, and we're going to do the Milah as early as possible on the day of the eighth day of the baby. So therefore, Rava sort of reformulates Rav Yosef's kasha, and he says the following: Rav Safra is contradicted by a Mishnah in Tamid Nishcha. The Mishnah establishes that it's not at the beginning of the seventh hour that we start the process of bringing the Tamid with Shechita. And when is the earliest time that we could possibly embark upon the Shechita of the Tamid? It's a half hour after Chatzos, after noon, what we call Sheva Umechza. And in fact, there was one day during some years when they were makdim, they took the earliest opportunity possible for Shchitas Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim, and that would be when Erev Pesach coincides with Erev Shabbos, which means that they have to afford due time for Tzlias HaPesach, or Tzlias HaPesach Adocha Shabbos. And the Mishnah establishes that in such a case, when Erev Pesach is on Erev Shabbos, Nishchat, the Tamid is slaughtered at the earliest possible time, which is Sheishu Mechza. Which means the Korban Pesach is going to start 1 hour later, Sheva Mechza. But there's a discrepancy here between Rav Safra deriving the earliest time for the Tamid from Avram Avinu and this Mishnah in Psachim. Whereas Rav Safra deriving from the Mincha of Avram Avinu would argue that the earliest time for the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim is noon, 12 noon. Set your clocks to 12 noon. That's against the Mishnah in Psachim, which establishes that the Shchitas HaTamid, in its earliest possible time, which is when Erev Pesach is Erev Shabbos, is going to be at 12 and a half hours. B'sheish u'mechza. Which means a full half hour later. A full half hour. Okay. So now, the Gemara asks, V'nishchete michi mashkere kosle. Why are we waiting that extra half hour? We should be slaughtering the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim already a half hour earlier when the clock strikes 12 at the beginning of the 7th hour. Ella, what? The Mishnah says, no, we're going to wait another half hour till the middle of the 6th hour or halb sheva. And if that be the case, then we shouldn't be davening mincha at 12 noon. We should be davening mincha at the earliest 12:30. So this is Rav Yosef's kasha. We are, in effect, in a big contradiction here between Rav Safra deriving from Avram Avinu that the earliest time for mincha is at 12 noon, and the Mishnah Psachim, the earliest time for the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim is 12 and a half. So we're up to my kusha. Let's make sure we all have the place. We're in Chav Chesam and Beis, and it's about 20 lines down from the top. You'll see a line that starts with V'nishchete, and he says, my kusha. Dilma, kosle de Beis HaMikdash, b'sheishu mechza mashchere. In other words, the Gemara is now reinterpreting the concept of mashchere kosle. We thought mashchere kosle we envision as a perfectly vertical kosel, such that when the sun reaches its pinnacle, there's no shadow, but as soon as it tilts towards the west, there'll be a shadow on the east. And that's, let's call it 1201. Says the Gemara, no. That's not what Mishkere Kosle means. Mishum, right? Dilma, Kosle de Beis HaMikdash b'sheishu mechza Mishkere, Mishum d'lo machavnei tuve. So what were the Kosle Beis HaMikdash like? And why did it take an extra half hour until they became dark? The Rashi here has a long, complicated presentation, and we'll try to do the best we can. I don't know if you're familiar with a building in Manhattan called the Grace Building. It's one of the most amazing architectural accomplishments in Manhattan, in mid-Manhattan. And it's a building that goes on a curve. It's really an amazing sight to see. I remember this from my childhood. I don't know what it looks like today after the riots, that I don't know. But anyway, so this is the new interpretation in the first answer that the Gemara is offering. There are going to be quite a few answers. That the Ksalim, about which the Mishnah in Talmud Mishkat says that we have to wait until the shade of the sun appears and is apparent on the eastern side. They're talking about Kotzle Beis HaMikdash, which are not skufim. They are not absolutely vertical. Yeshar legamri, bezovis yeshar gedam. Elo shenituyim ma'at. They are somewhat tilted. What that means is because of its curvature, he says the walls of the Beis Hamikdash are wider at the bottom, and they get narrower as you move towards the top. And therefore, when the sun is at the zenith at Chatzos Hayom at noon, he says, Ein Sfas HaKosel Matzila Al Tzadav. Right? We want to get the shade on the right side. But if there's a curvature, then the top of that curvature is going to receive the sunlight even after Chatzos. In other words, the sun and its light is going to bounce off the top of the curvature. It's going to take a full half hour until you'll see shade on the eastern side. He says, Gam kasher omedes hachama berum ha-rakia b'chatzos, ein tzvas ha-kotzel matzila al tzidov, sha'chelik ha-tachton shel ha-kotzel boleit ma'at, v'nosar galui klape hachama. In other words, the kosel on the bottom is sort of like sticking itself out because there's a curvature. And by doing so, kasher mamshicha chama, right? So it's the curvature on the western side that's exposed to the sun, and it's only when the sun continues west, and it's going to take another half hour, only b'shah sheishu mechza, then we'll see the tzel, the shade on the eastern side of the coast. And that's the time that we're going to check the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim. Now, the Ritva is not happy with this interpretation that we presented based on this long Rashi. He says, "V'chi b'kosle beis hamikdash toli adovar," because the shade will appear on the kosle beis hamikdash given that curvature later on. Therefore, we can't bring the carbon tamid. Yesh lishchot atamid. We should be shechting the carbon tamid at the earliest possible time. Ubechatzos hayom toli adom. Ubir shetiknu chachamim zman atamid lefi hashcharas kosle beis hamikdash lefi she'ein nira lanoshim shehigia al chatzos hayom ad shehem machshirim v'im hayu shochtim kodem l'chenes hatamid yitoim lachshav shemuto lichot tamid kodem chatzos hayom. He's saying that the problem is the spectator. The spectator sees the kohanim shechting the carbon tamid shel ben arbaim, and yet they don't see any shade on the eastern side because of the curvature of the kosel beis hamikdash. So they're there, like very close proximity on the spot. They see that the kohanim are already bringing the carbon tamid, and they're looking at the time of the day. Wait a second, there's no shade on the east. We must be at 11:30 in the morning. And they're going to come to the mistaken conclusion that we don't need to wait for daylight or for day in order to bring the carbon tamid. Let's bring it earlier. V'chein yavo lispal mincha kodem hazman. V'chein kavu hazman al pi kosle beis hamikdash. So it's really fascinating that according to the Ritva, this is all a rabbinic institution that we wait the extra half hour. On a Doraisa level, the time for the carbon tamid shel ben arbaim is 12 noon. But since the Kosle Beis HaMedrash had that curvature, therefore there was a fear that people would think that they're bringing the carbon tamid shel ben arbaim even before 12 noon, because they don't see the shadow. Therefore, they made a takana, which is all rabbinic, that we will wait the extra half hour. By then, for sure, there'll be shade on the eastern side of the koso, and no one will have any problem. Now, Tfilas Mincha is a rabbinic institution, and once again, in order to avoid a situation where a person might have a mincha too early, and it's before Chatzos Yom, we're going to add another half hour. That's how the Ritva learns this sugya. In Rashi's frame of reference, you get the impression that we're dealing with a din d'oraisa, and we're taking on an extra half hour on a d'oraisa level, not because of some sort of a mistake on the part of the spectators, but simply because we must have the tzlolim, the shade on the right side, which we don't have. Now, the only question that bothers me here is, at this point in the Gemara, how is the Gemara now interpreting Rav Safra? Because Rav Safra was the one who said, Slusei de Avram Michi Mashchere Kosle. Clearly, Rav Safra is not referring to the Kosle, the Ksolim of the Beis HaMikdash. So I don't find that here. Let me just see, by chance, if it's not here in the Mesifta, maybe it's here. Oh, I have the wrong. He writes here, perhaps the walls of the Holy Temple became darkened at 6.5 hours because they weren't exactly straight. I mean, I think he means by straight vertical. We'll see as a note on this. The walls of the temple were tapered. Okay, I call them curved, with their bases broader than their tops. So they get thinner on top. The sun would shine on their eastern sides, even when it was already in the western half of the sky, up until a half hour after midday. The sun would shine on their eastern side. I mean, look, the bottom line is he's saying he's coming to the same conclusion as us, but I think through a different entranceway. But he's pointing out that you'll still see sun on the eastern side, even though it's afternoon, right? And only when you calculate a half hour afternoon, so the sun is now past its midpoint towards the west, a half hour's worth, only then will you see shade on the eastern side. Just that he has some sort of different physics than what we had. Thus, even the afternoon Talmud could technically, now he's going with the Ritva, could technically be offered at midday. I think he's mixing the Ritva here with Rashi. I'm not sure. He says, if the Talmud was slaughtered in the temple when the sun was still shining down on the eastern side of the wall, which is Chatzos, then people would mistakenly think that's permitted to slaughter the Talmud, and for that matter, pray Mincha, before midday, meaning in the morning, in as much as they're habitually regard midday as the time that shadows are falling on the eastern side. Okay. Okay, now we get up to the second answer of the Gemara. Inami, the Gemara says we can find a different reconciliation. The answer of Yosef's kasha against Rav Safra. Shiny Avram, it's tagninisu it's tagnininus gidola haisa beliba. In other words, Avram was a Baki Gadol. He knew all about the movements of the stars and the constellations, all the, positions and movement of Shamayim, Garmei Shamayim. And he knew how to calculate exactly the time of Bein Harbayim. He could be mispal mincha exactly at Bein Harbayim, meaning at noon. But Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash, they would have to wait and delay the Tamid until Sheishu Mechza, or all of Israel with regard to Tfilas Mincha, because we don't have that Bekias. We cannot actually know when is midday. Ein kol adam yochel lechaven. Therefore, we have to add a half hour. This for sure sounds like the Ritva and his approach, that we're dealing with some sort of a derabbanan. We're lacking in the Bekias of Avram Avinu, and therefore the halacha was established that we wait another half hour. But really the time for the Talmud and for Mincha is Chatzos Yom. Inami, a third answer, Mishum de Zaken v'yoshev b'yeshiva hava. Okay, now we're talking about Avram Avinu's theoretical knowledge, not his bekius and his practical knowledge of different astronomical phenomena, but the fact that he was a zaken. What's a zaken? A zaken means someone who's yoshev b'yeshiva. He's marba b'yeshiva, and he increases his time of learning Torah. He is therefore a zaken shekana chachma. And this is going to stimulate an entire agadata here about what the word zaken means. Zaken, the Gemara says, is Yoshev b'yeshiva, and he sat and he dedicated himself to the study of Torah. And based on his knowledge of Torah, somehow, magically, he was able to determine exactly when Chatzos is. And now, in the context of this Haggadah, the Gemara is going to show us that the word Zaken means Chachma. The Amar Rabbi Chama Rabbi Chanina, Mimeim Shel Avosenu Lo Parsha Yeshiva Mehem. That Klal Yisrael, during its entire history, dating back to Avraham Avinu, was always dedicated to yeshiva. Yeshiva meaning a place for the study of Torah, the place for Horah. And therefore, when they were in Mitzrayim, Hoyim b'Mitzrayim is yeshiva imon. Even in Mitzrayim, Rabbi say, they had a yeshiva. Shenemar. I mean, again, the Jews were in Mitzrayim for so long. How did they have zakenim that were marbe b'yeshiva? But take a look. Shenemar, Hashem says to Moshe, with regard to the geula of Mitzrayim, he says, Lech v'asafta es ziknei Yisrael. And what does ziknei Yisrael means? Elu shekanu chachma. Okay, fine. So now we have completed the first period of Jewish history. Now we're up to the second period of Jewish history. We left Mitzrayim with 40 years in the Midbar. It's Hoy b'Midbar Yeshivi Moim. Even in the Midbar they had yeshivas. Shenemar, interesting proof. Esfo li shivim ishmi ziknei Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu is given the command in the Midbar to gather together 70 men of the Ziknei Yisrael. And they are the Ziknei Al-Am, who are absolutely knowledgeable in the Torah. And Avram Avinu, we're going to go through the three avos and show that each one of the avos is called a zaken. Number one, zaken v'yoshev yeshiva yishenemar the Avram zaken baba yamim. So Avram Avinu was certainly the trailblazer and took bikone Torah and Chachma. Yitzchak Avinu zaken v'yeshiva v'yoshev yeshiva shenemar vayhiki zaken Yitzchak. And then Yaakov Avinu Zakev Yoshev Yeshiva Yeshenemar Bnei Yisrael Kavdu Mizoken. Again, in each case, the word zikna is used in a different context, but the bottom line is each one of the avos is described by as a zaken. Not only that, Eliezer Eved Avram Zaken Yoshev Yeshiva Yeshenemar Vayomer Avram El Avdo Zakan Beiso. So the word zakan here is being used to describe Avram. I'm sorry, to describe Eliezer, Eved Avram. Now, what's unique about Eliezer? If his master, Avram, was dedicated to the study of Torah, then Avram Avinu, as his master, would convey and transmit the Torah to his trusty, loyal Eved, and that's Eliezer. HaMoshel b'chol asher lo, who was in charge of everything, all the possessions of Avram. The Omar Rabbi Elazar, HaMoshe b'chol asher lo, Shemoshel b'Toras Rabbo. Wow. Eliezer Eved Avram was a great scholar. He was in total control intellectually. He had in his back pocket the entire Torah that was transmitted to him by Avram. This is all because Yitzchak wasn't around. And now the Gemara gives another drasha. It says regarding Avram, regarding Eliezer, it says "Uben Meshek Beisi Huda Mesek Eliezer." Amar Abelazar. What does that word Demesek mean? She dola umashke mitoraso shel rabo liacheru. So let's see which letters. The first letter is Dalet, the second is Mem, the third is Shin, and the fourth is Kuf. So he takes the Dalet as Dole, and then he takes the Mem as Mashke, then he has the Shin, which is also Mashke, and Dole Mitoraso Shel Rab. Now, Dole is a very interesting mashal. It means you have a well, and you put the barrel and you draw water from the well. But what do you do with the well? You share it with the water in the in the barrel, you share it with other people. So Eliezer was not just learning and soaking up his Rebbe Avram's Torah for himself, but he also was dole le'acher, mashke dole mashke le'acher. He transmitted the Torah of Avram to others. And now we begin a long Agadah. Well, actually, it's a pretty short Agadah relative to Agadah. And we're not going to get too far today, but Omar Rav, Kiyem Avram Avinu Kol Torah Kula. So the Torah wasn't given yet, and yet Avram Avinu was Mekayim the entirety of the Torah Shenemar. When Hashem promises Yitzchak that whatever he promised his father Avram he would fulfill, he says, Ekev Asher, now HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling Yitzchak who his father was, meaning how great was Avram. Ekev Asher Shama Avram L'Koli, and then the pasuk says, Vayishmor Mishmarti, Mitzvosai, Chukosai, V'sorosai. Okay, Rabbosai, this is where we'll take a break. And we'll finish the Agadah quickly in Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow. Right, tomorrow's a Tainus, but I think we can learn on a Tainus, no? And we're up to Amalei Rav Simi Bar Chia L'Ra. Okay, then I wish everyone a great day. Thank you so much.